All right, guys, we have actually a big guest today, Andrew Yang, on the show, who we were supposed to have a while ago, but then had to cancel for COVID.
Yeah.
So find out how he's doing, check in with him about his big New York City mayoral race, where he is currently dominating in the polls,
He
much
is.
to the media's chagrin, which we will also discuss with him.
That's right. I'm actually really excited because there's a lot of stuff I really love about Andrew Yang, even to the extent to point out that I think he's better than Bernie on a bunch of issues. You know? So I love Andrew Yang in some ways, but there's other ways in which I'm very critical. And so what I want to do is explore all those things with him. I want to ask him about the areas where I agree and ask him about where I massively disagree.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've known Andrew for quite a while. I met him when I was at MSNBC, and he was running Venture for America, and we kept in touch some over those years. And so
that sounds like a Ponzi scheme, by the way.
So it does. Maybe that's why I moved on from it. No,
Venture for America.
It's not a Ponzi scheme. So I am not an unbiased Andrew Yang observer. I'm always cheering for the guy, is the bottom line. But yeah, like you, there were some things in his presidential campaign and especially some things in his New York mayoral's race that were questionable or disappointing to me. So we'll ask him about all of that stuff. But there's also a lot of big news this week about what Joe Biden's next moves might be. So, of course, got the relief bill done, which was supposed to be the emergency piece, $15 minimum wage, all the longer term stuff got stripped down. In fact, that was really the only piece that was supposed to be in that was going to be a longer term thing. There's a child tax credit, which is temporary. They assure us that they're going to extend it longer, et cetera, et cetera. But that was like the relief package. So now we're getting a little bit of a look at what he's hoping to put into, I guess this is the Build Back Better piece of the plan that's meant to be longer term, more structural
infrastructure plan.
Well, there's two pieces to it.
Okay.
There's the infrastructure piece, and then there's a social welfare piece.
Okay.
So the infrastructure, he's talking about $1 trillion. These are all reported details. He's officially announcing this on March 30th in Pittsburgh, but this is kind of what they leaked out to the press. $1 trillion for infrastructure, $200 billion for housing, $100 billion for green climate research and development. And then on the social welfare part, the big pieces are expanding that child benefit. Not permanently, though, just for a few more years, I guess for budgetary reasons. I don't really know why. And then adding on universal pre-K for young kids and 2 years of free community college on the other end. So those are the pieces. And
it's only 2 years.
For community college. Yes.
Ooh, I thought it was 4.
2 years community college. Yeah. So it's
wait, that's going back on the campaign promise thing, because he said free for everybody under $125,000.
Correct. Yes, that is correct.
Oh.
Yes. Like, why? And then there's also big questions about, like, how seriously should you actually take this plan when we're not sure we have a mechanism to pass it? So a lot of these pieces you could do through reconciliation, but Joe Manchin had said before that he didn't want to do another thing through reconciliation without having Republicans on board.
Yeah.
Will he change his mind? Maybe. He's out saying, hey, I would go huge on infrastructure. So basically seeming open to this plan by and large. But again, does he draw a hard line on there's got to be Republicans on board, because there will 100% be 0 Republicans on board with this plan. And then the other piece is, is there any sort of real movement on the filibuster? Biden has seemed to open himself up more to the idea of getting rid of the filibuster altogether, or at least doing a talking filibuster reform. Again, Manchin has been, and Sinema and a couple others have been the big stumbling block there. So in some ways, as big of a question in this package is how and what the mechanics are. Do they split it into 2 bills? Are they going to try to push it through regular order where you need 60 votes? Are they going to get rid of the filibuster? Are they going to do it through reconciliation? Those mechanical process things, as sort of like brain numbing as they are as important as what the details of the bill are.
Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff to talk about here. So I agree with you completely. The whole conversation is moot and useless if we don't do either filibuster elimination or filibuster reform.
Yeah.
If you don't do that, it's just dumb to even have the conversation. There's literally no way you're going to get 60 for any of it.
Right.
Not even any
You're not
little
going
piece
to
of
get
it.
one. It would be a miracle to get one.
Now, I saw the reporting, too, that, Biden's now open or whatever to eliminating the filibuster, but I'm skeptical because it's, you never know what the media misinterprets on purpose or puts out. You know what I mean? Like, you never know until let me see it. Let me see what
Right.
you're gonna fucking do. I don't care about what they're reporting you're gonna do.
Well, and on that, you could easily see that as a tactic to try to get Republicans to the table. Like, look, if you guys aren't going to work for it,
That
with
ain't
us,
gonna work with fucking getting 9
I
of
know.
them. My ass cheeks, you're gonna get 9 of them.
I know. It's not going to work, but you could see them using that as a tactic
Yes.
to try to say, look, if you guys don't do something with us, then we're going to blow this whole thing up and get rid of the filibuster, and then you'll have no power.
Okay, so now let's go through the specifics of it. $1 trillion for infrastructure, woefully inadequate. So inadequate, Joe Manchin himself was, I think he said 3 or 4 trillion. That's Joe Manchin saying that. Now, Bernie's plan when he ran, you know what it was all in? About $16 trillion to spend on infrastructure.
Wow.
So, and by the way, I went and looked this up because I was really interested in what the experts say the actual number is to adequately upgrade everything. As of 2017, the number was 4.7 trillion just to adequately upgrade it. Now, I'm of the belief that if I ever ran for president, one of my main things that I would run on is basically making the U.S. infrastructure #1 in the world. I want A++ infrastructure that would make other countries jealous of us because it's so fantastic. And really, when you talk about dealing with the Republicans or even just dealing, with some of the more conservative Democrats, if you're not coming in at 10 trillion to then get to the 5 trillion, which is what is just adequate.
Right.
Then what are we doing? You're coming in at $1 trillion?
Right.
What do you think it is? 1984? Like,
Right.
I don't understand what you're doing.
And why?
So
why arbitrarily limit yourself like that?
Because he probably doesn't really care. But anyway, so $1 trillion for infrastructure, woefully inadequate. $200 billion for housing. I'm not sure what the actual number would be that experts say is necessary for that. $100 billion for climate. Again, I'm not sure what the experts say is ideal on that. The expanding the child benefit thing, that kind of annoys me because, like you said, it's only temporary. And that's the problem with the COVID bill as well. It's like, if you're only doing the temporary shot of adrenaline, you don't have a fucking legacy. You don't have a legacy. You want a legacy? Give me something permanent. Give me something like Medicare. Give me something like Social Security. Give me something that'll last a generation.
Right.
I would rather have a UBI at $800 a month in perpetuity than the one-time check of $1,400 or whatever.
Obviously.
The fuck, you know?
Yeah, obviously.
Then you said expanding, we already did that one. Universal pre-K was the other one. The details of that are going to matter, but if they actually do that, that'd be phenomenal.
Huge.
And the 2 years of free community college, like we said, is going back on his campaign. He's done this so many times, where originally he was saying free college for everybody if you make under $125,000. This actually reminds me of when he was on the campaign trail. Public option for healthcare, and then that just became subsidized COBRA and expand ACA subsidies.
Which is also in here, is ACA subsidies, which they did in the relief bill, again, temporarily. They're paying for people's COBRA, which is a giant health insurer giveaway.
That's it.
Giant health insurer giveaway. And then, they expanded subsidies of the ACA. That is a good thing. That will mean that more people can afford to buy healthcare on the exchanges, but that's not what you promised on the campaign trail.
And it's also a ruse. They're really just stealing money they're giving money to the health insurance companies.
It's another health insurer giveaway. This is very comfortable. This gives them guaranteed income. That's great. More customers for the health insurers, right? So again, it's a marginal improvement. It's better. More people will be able to afford it.
Better than Trump, the classic thing. Wow.
Also, it leaves you really, it's not a structural change also because it leaves you really vulnerable to, the next president doesn't up the subsidies, takes them down or just leaves them where they are and lets inflation do its thing. This creates a real vulnerability, whereas obviously you and I would like to see Medicare for all, but even public option, at least that's something different, where there's a public competitor where you can buy into Medicare, where you have a real additional government competitor in the marketplace. That would be a real change.
Yeah.
Whereas subsidies, it's a temporary Band-Aid. So there's a lot to be critical of here if they even actually are able to muster the will to get it through.
So the big issues, it's a one-time shot of adrenaline, like you said, and like we were just talking about. It's not in perpetuity. It's not continuous, and there's no way to put a positive spin on that to say this is going to leave me a legacy. It's just not going to leave him a legacy. And so let's talk about the tax plan a little bit too, because there's a lot more that came out.
Yeah.
So I have here, let me tell you what Jeff Stein is reporting. Major Biden tax hikes eyed for next bill. This is not final. And actually, before I get to that, let me say this. My biggest issue with this is, again, it's classic corporate Democrat, is that you're compromising up front. You're giving like the halfway
Right.
position up front. And when you give the halfway position up front, now you have nowhere to go because the Republicans are going to tell you to go fuck yourself. And on a lot of these things, even Manchin and Sinema are going to tell you, well, I want even less than that. So if you're not coming in hot and you're not coming in with stuff that's recurring, we're going to end up in Nowheresville. But anyway, back to the taxes. So Biden wants the corporate tax rate to go from 21%, which is what it is now, to 28%. A global minimum tax to 21%. We'll come back to all this stuff. Top income tax rate to go to 39.6%, which is about what it was in the Obama years. They want to end fossil fuel subsidies. They want to tax investment gains of $1 million or more as wage income as opposed to capital gains, which would raise that rate for wealthy people. They want to tax assets that are passed on at death, and they don't want to do anything with the SALT deduction. The SALT deduction is the state and local tax deduction, where if you're in blue states and you pay a lot of taxes at the state level, the federal government used to let you deduct that off your federal tax bill.
Right.
But Trump got rid of that to sort of punish wealthy people in blue states.
Right.
And Biden's like, I'm going to leave that because it's okay to raise taxes on wealthy people.
Well, that's exactly right. The key thing there is that largely affects upper income taxpayers. And actually, a lot of Democrats have been pushing Schumer and Pelosi, who both represent California and New York, states where this is very relevant and where their heeled constituents are very concerned about this. Biden smartly pushes that off the table.
Yes.
And that is one thing, I know you want to talk about each of these, but one thing I've noticed with him, so he doesn't back a financial transactions tax, doesn't back a wealth tax, right? Doesn't back a public option. The things that are sort of like named and labeled, he really seeks to avoid. And I almost wonder if it's a political strategy of like, the wealth tax is phenomenally popular. Financial transactions tax is phenomenally popular. But they also are things that the Republican base understands what they are. Like, they've been branded enough that you would probably get a partisan divide on support of those things, even though, again, broadly they're popular. So it seems like he goes for policies that haven't been sort of like branded on the national stage, because it makes it harder for the Republicans ultimately to attack.
Yeah, he's scared of his own shadow.
The SALT thing is another example of that, though, where it's like Republican. If you watch Fox News, they've educated their audience about the SALT tax and why it's silly that Democrats want to give rich people a tax break through the SALT thing, and they've demonized this successfully. So he just leaves it off the table so he doesn't have to deal with that. Which, again, in that instance, is actually the right move.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So now let's go through one by one. Corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%. Before the Trump tax bill in 2017, the top nominal rate for corporations was 35%. So again, this is classic Democrat. He's not saying, let's go back to the 35. He's not saying it should be even more than 35. It should be 40 or whatever.
Right.
He's saying, no, I'm going to go to 28, which is splitting the difference. So that's classic Democrat. That annoys the shit out of me. The global minimum tax, I honestly don't even know why we're having the conversation about it. It sounded cool in theory, and I was actually a little excited about it when I saw the original articles. Then as soon as I read the articles on it, I was like, every article's like, this is totally unenforceable. So why are we having a conversation? Like, what's the point? Is it just a virtue signaling exercise? Is that what it is? I guess that's what it is, right? Because, again, totally unenforceable. The top income tax rate to 39.6%. Again, that goes back to roughly what it was in the Obama years. Again, I just think that's silly. Under Dwight Eisenhower, the top marginal rate was 93%. Under JFK, it was about 70%. And again, marginal taxes are not the same as, a lot of people don't know what marginal rates are. They don't understand that that's taxing every dollar above a certain line, So there are plans that are like every dollar you make over $1 million per year gets taxed at whatever, 50%, 60%. Right. It's not the government comes and takes 50 or 60% of all your money. You know what I mean?
Right.
But just going back to the Obama years, again, we need a lot more than that. You need to raise taxes on the wealthy a lot more than that. Ending fossil fuel subsidies is unquestionably positive. Right? Yep. There's no by the ways in that one. And the taxing investment gains over $1 million as wage income as opposed to capital gains, that's good. But honestly, I think I'm of the belief you should tax it all like it's income.
Agreed.
Because it's just gambling.
Agreed.
Gambling in the stock market. Why should you pay less than somebody who's a teacher or a construction worker or an accountant or somebody who actually works
who's
for a
actually
living?
working versus just like moving money around.
Right.
Yeah. I substantively agree with 100% of that. I do think there's a political cleverness here, though, that makes it very hard for the right or even right-wing Democrats to attack, which is one of the big pledges. Remember, one of the big things that Biden talked about on the campaign trail is he wasn't going to raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000. It's a lot of money to make in a year. And that is a significant increase from what Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama had as their line. Theirs was $250. I'm not going to raise taxes on anybody who's making less than $250. And so I think the Obama-Hillary position is obviously the better position versus Biden, who draws this line at 400. However, some of the biggest pains in the asses and some of the most powerful constituencies in American politics are the $250,000 to $400,000 people. And they are people that are also largely in the Democratic base. That is the base of the party right now. They're extremely vocal. They're extremely powerful. They're a giant pain in the ass. And so Biden leaps over all of their criticism by just saying, I'm not going to touch you guys. I'm only going to touch the wealthy. And I think you see that, too, in the capital gains thing of the first $1 million you're going to continue to get favorable treatment on. It's only people who are making more than $1 million in capital gains that we're going to touch. So, again, I think that there's a political cleverness here that is going to make it hard for Republicans to really muster a defense of this thing or to demonize this thing. I saw Mitch McConnell came out and said, like, oh, the infrastructure is just a Trojan horse and they're going to put all the tax hikes inside. All this stuff is extraordinarily popular. It's very, very modest, as you're pointing out. It's like not nearly what they could or should ultimately be doing. But I think you're going to see a replay from the Republicans of the relief bill where they don't vote for it, but they don't even really try to resist it. They don't try to demonize it. They just move on to like, let's just talk about the border, or let's just talk about whatever the Dr. Seuss controversy of the day is, because this package is too sort of unobjectionable for them to really be able to wrap their hands around and demonize effectively.
So I actually disagree with you because in my experience, and I hope it ends up like the COVID relief package where they end up doing that. But my fear is, and I've already seen some of this going on, is that they'll just lie about it. Is that they'll just be like, Biden's raising taxes on the middle class and working people. How dare he? Biggest tax increase in history. They'll say some nonsense like that, and they'll run with it, and they'll hammer away, and then eventually it'll land and it'll move the polls a little bit. But you mentioned political cleverness there. Let me tell you what I would view as politically clever. He's half being politically clever with the whole like $400,000 and less, not going to raise your taxes. But what I would do is I would actually say, I'm actually going to cut taxes for middle-class families and poor folks. Because I've never met a tax cut I didn't like for those people because they need more money. So I would say that. But then the other thing I would do, I would go hard in the other direction for the wealthy, where I would even float things I'm not even sure I necessarily believe in. 100% tax on all net worth above $1 billion.
I do believe in that.
No more billionaires.
I would be all
I
on
like
board
them
with
apples.
that.
And the point of doing that...
I will instantly become a Biden stan if you did that.
The point of doing that is the classic move, why you should be a lefty with a backbone, is it baits the Republicans into arguing phenomenally unpopular positions. If you're out there yelling about $15 minimum wage and they go, I don't want a $15 minimum wage, you win. You won because they just said it. They just said the thing that they weren't supposed to say. I think everybody should have health care in the middle of a pandemic. I don't think everybody should have health care. I win. Thank you. So let's have that debate, and I want Biden to stake a position that's as progressive as can be. I want him to be the most badass social democrat of all time, where he's like, we're gonna tax capital gains more than we tax income, because that's the way it should be. You're just gambling in the stock market. Pay more, bitch. Like, I want that kind of an approach. I want the top marginal tax rate. Again, let's make the top marginal tax rate. Let's go back to Dwight Eisenhower. I agree with the Republican Dwight Eisenhower. 93% for the top marginal tax rate on everything above $5 million.
Yep.
How you like me now?
Yep.
That's what you do. So bait them into defending the wealthy very clearly, and then you win.
Right. Well, their strategy is like the basement strategy. It's like the continuation of the basement strategy. They just want to avoid a debate altogether.
Yes, that's right.
We don't want to. And so, again, something like the financial transactions tax. I mean, you could take that case to the American people all day long, go all have the fight, go on cable news, divide the country along. I mean, it's probably 70% in favor of it, and Republicans would be there freaking out. But their approach is to try to, I mean, as much as Obama was like no drama Obama, they're the ones who are really trying to take the no drama approach.
Yeah.
We're going to craft everything from the beginning to just even to avoid a debate. That's what they did on the relief bill. And again, I think it's part of why they don't put any of the sort of named branded policy ideas into their proposals. So like they're not going to do a Green New Deal, but they'll do some climate stuff that you really can't object to on the like sort of merits of. They'll do something in healthcare, but it's not going to be even the public option because even that's too sort of like name branded at this point. They're not going to do a wealth tax. They're not going to do a financial transactions tax. And you're right. I think your strategy would be more, it would accomplish more, number one. I do think it would lead to him being a much more popular president. But the strategy he's pursuing is going to get him, where he is, which is like 56% approval rating, Democrats being kind of like right on the door of being able to hold on to their power in the midterms if his approval rating stays in that place. So there could be a worse strategy, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah.
There is there is a logic to it. He's not going to be what we want him to be. That's just not who he is. Right.
Yeah.
So in terms of Joe Biden's best strategy, this is probably the best political strategy you could imagine from Joe Biden.
Well, let me just give you my biggest fear about this approach, because I really think it comes down to this. My biggest fear is, I think you're right in your description of his strategy.
Yeah, the basement strategy.
Yes, it's definitely the basement strategy. But my biggest fear is, since you're coming in sort of weak at like corporate tax rate to 28%, not back to 35%, top income tax rate to 39.6%, what you're doing is now you've set the terms of the debate and you've defined the left fringe. And now Manchin and Sinema and the evil 8 Democrats who are against the minimum wage increase, they're going to be like, you're saying 39.6? I'll give you 36.
Yeah.
Whereas if he came in at like, no, 70% for everything above $1 million.
Right.
Then they're, okay, maybe I'll do 50. I won't do 70. I'll do 45.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So he's defined the debate in a bad way up front, where now even the nefarious elements and the more conservative elements of his own party, they could wreck it even worse than the Republicans, who are never going to come along with any of it.
Well, and here's the other thing. The flip side of the like no-name branded policy idea political play is that it doesn't give people much to like really get excited about.
Yes, that's
it's
true
like,
too, yeah.
Yeah, it's harder to.
It's not FDR. That's not FDR.
It's not FDR. You look at this and you're like, I'm looking right now at the tax hike proposals. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Sure,
all right.
that's fine.
Better than Trump.
It's better, right?
Exactly.
And that was the thing that Obama struggled with is his plans were better than the Republican plans, better than what they would have done if they had won the presidency, but it wasn't enough for his base to show up and vote in 2010.
That's
and that was the biggest problem. You did have an energized Republican base, but you also had a de-energized Democratic base who had been told, number one, basically like, I got this, you guys can, peace out. Thanks for electing me president. Good luck with your lives. You can go home now. And weren't given much to really fight for because all of the solutions offered were so sort of like milquetoast and middle of the road. What Biden will benefit from is just because of the sugar high, because of the vaccinations, he is very likely to have a really strong economy. How much of that is his doing or not is very open to debate.
The relief bill definitely has
something to do with it, for sure. But also it's just like the vaccines are going on. He partly gets credit for that too. That's going relatively well compared to the rest of the world. So he's going to get an outsized political benefit just from kind of being in the right place at the right time, which has been the story of Joe Biden's like ascent to the presidency from the beginning.
Yeah, but okay, but here's the thing. Think about how much better it could be if he did the same thing that we were talking about. Oh my God, if Trump just did one thing, he would have won. If Biden just does one big, bold thing, then you're talking about way more, 10 more points in popularity, like if
you're also talking about something you're also talking about something that's durable.
Yes,
versus
durable.
like,
exactly.
Let me hope the economy is in the right place when I happen to be running again or when we happen to have the midterms.
This stuff is all low key. Whatever you think of this stuff, it's all low key, right? Hit me with one big. I'm actually gonna $1,000 UBI. We're gonna get this passed. We're gonna actually do that, and it's gonna. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
People would lose it.
Right.
He would see. This is the thing, Krystal. People don't realize that like we're all jaded and biased by our current moment in history, and so the way everybody thinks about this stuff now is like, well, presidential elections in the U.S. they are what they are. They're relatively close. They're always going to be relatively close. That is not even close to true. You go back even to some of Bill Clinton's races, total blowouts. Ronald Reagan's race, total blowout. FDR won 4 times, and there was one time he won, what, every state but 1 or 2? People don't realize that is still possible. I don't care about how ruthlessly partisan everything is. If you materially improve people's lives in a way that's really clear and they know you were the one who was fighting for it, you were the one who was doing for it, all the bitching and moaning in the culture war, Dr. Seuss, Mr. Potato Head bullshit, people will overlook that and be like, I'm going to vote for you because you just put money in my bank account. You're continuing to put money in my bank account. So that's the thing is like, if you think big and if you act big, you can change the whole game.
Yeah.
I mean, win with fucking 40 states in the next election if you really want to go big and really want to do good by the American people.
That is correct. And that is not Joe Biden.
That's exactly right.
Yes, that is, I mean, and that is the thing is if you have that kind of politics that people really personally experience as transformational and changing what's possible for them in their lives, then it just totally exposes the like Potato Head and Dr. Seuss stuff for just how petty and silly it really is.
That's exactly
I mean,
right.
you try to bring that and people are going to laugh you out of the room.
Yeah, like, why the fuck are we talking about this? What does that have to do with government?
Yeah, but if you're tinkering around the edges, you're up in this tax rate here, that one there a little bit in a way that no one is going to actually really notice. If you're doing some infrastructure, but again, like you're not really going to see it in your community, your bridge that was falling down just might be slightly less falling down, then yeah, you can still get sort of caught into those, the biggest issue for me is whether I can buy every single Dr. Seuss book at the moment that I want to buy it, which is also a hilarious side note because some of Dr. Seuss's books are phenomenally left-wing and anti-capitalist, which I really enjoy.
Oh, that's interesting.
The Lorax in particular.
That's interesting. I was under the impression that he was a deep bigot.
The Lorax is, I mean, I think he was a bigot in his time, for sure.
But he was an anti-capitalist.
The Lorax is completely anti-capitalist and like it's like environmentalist and anti-capitalist. It's a great book. You should check it out.
I'm a grown-ass man. You want me to read Dr. Seuss by myself? Is that what you want me to do?
I'll bring it to you. We'll do a reading here.
Imagine me on like a Saturday night sitting there reading Dr. Seuss.
But you ready for this turn? You know who understands the power of transformational, big picture, tangible politics?
Oprah?
Andrew Yang.
Oh, Andrew Yang too.
I don't really feel like I need to introduce him, but you guys know Andrew Yang, former presidential candidate, leading candidate right now for mayor of New York. Really interesting thinker, and we are excited to welcome him now. Andrew Yang, it is so great to see you. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing better for seeing the two of you, and I love that you're in the same location. Like, it feels like old times. Congratulations on the new podcast. I'm told that it's like this mega hit.
You are told correctly. Everybody loves it, obviously. No, but we were supposed to talk to you a few weeks back or a month back. I don't know. Time is a flat circle. And you unfortunately came down with coronavirus. Very inconsiderate of you. How are you feeling? Have you fully recovered? Have you been having any of those longer term symptoms? How are you doing physically?
Thanks for asking, Krystal. COVID was a very difficult time, but I'm feeling much better now. I'd say that I'm not a long hauler. Like, I don't have any of those kinds of effects, but there's still like this very faint residual shortness of breath and a little bit of lung fatigue. But I'm feeling a million times better than I was a month plus ago.
So we're glad to hear that you're doing a lot better. I remember when we first heard the news, we were both sort of floored. So glad you're doing better. To jump into some policy talk, I mean, the main reason why you sort of hit the scene and became a big hit and really blew up in the presidential election is everybody knew you as like, you're the UBI guy, you're the universal basic income guy. And, got to give you a lot of credit because you put it on the map. And I really don't think without your contribution to that it would have blown up to the place we are now, where even with the pandemic happening, you saw it increase even more in popularity, where now it's like overwhelmingly. I haven't seen the most recent numbers, but it's like 70% or something like that. I mean, it's really up there.
The direct checks, I know, were the single most popular component of Biden's very popular relief bill. And I do think that owes in large part to you starting that conversation.
Yeah, and I think even when you poll the recurring checks, universal basic income, it's still sky high. But anyway, one of the criticisms of you that I thought was interesting on UBI, I wanted to ask your opinion on this, is there's a right-wing version of UBI and there's a left-wing version of UBI. And to sum it up, the left-wing version of UBI is that when you cut the checks, it needs to be equal to or more in monetary value than what the current social safety net is paying people and offering people in a variety of different ways. The right-wing version of UBI is, hey, let's sort of like scrap the social safety net and just cut people a check, but the dollar amount would be basically less than what people are currently getting through the social safety net. So let me ask you, in your conception of an ideal UBI, how does it work? Does it work with the social safety net? Is it something that's additional to the social safety net, or are there social safety net cuts and then you do the UBI to match the dollar amount? Explain that for us.
Sure. Well, first, I want to thank both of you for helping, frankly, provide me a platform when I was running for president. It was not the most mainstream proposal when I championed universal basic income. And I think if people reflect on the first time they heard it, maybe on a debate stage, it was literally laughed at, where I was like,
that's right.
We should just give everyone $1,000 a month. And people were like, ha ha. Mainstream media commentators were like, this is not a serious consideration. And it was folks like you that helped elevate my campaign to a point where people started taking it seriously. And now, as you said, a majority of Americans are for universal basic income. Something like 85% are for cash relief during the pandemic. And so this is going to, in my mind, be front and center in terms of our public policy discussions ongoing. To your question, Kyle, about sort of versions of UBI, I always had the physician principle of do no harm in mind. I met hundreds, maybe thousands of people who are dependent on various safety net programs when I was running for president. And the last thing you want to do is diminish the level of resources available to people who are in that position. So I always wanted to do more for people, not less. There are intricacies to our system so that people can find edge cases. But for me, it was always trying to improve people's lives and not taking anything away from anyone.
You originally came up with or leaned into the UBI solution because some of the research that you did around automation, the way that it was causing job loss, the way it was transforming our workforce, the way that transformation had led to increased votes for Donald Trump. Do you still see that as like the driving reason to move forward with UBI, or have your views shifted at all?
Unfortunately, Krystal, we're living a version of the future I'd feared, where the pandemic has sped up the automation of many jobs. I mean, you're seeing tens of thousands of retail locations close either temporarily or forever. And now even public sentiment has shifted, where if you walk into a store and you see self-checkout or a robot cleaner, you're not mad at it anymore. You're just like, oh, that makes sense now. And so there are companies that have just come out and said, from Google to Tyson Foods to Sam's Club, saying, we're going to try and make our operations more robotic. And now people are embracing that shift to a much higher degree than they did. So I was concerned about the fact that people were going to lose their jobs. And as we're having this conversation, the American labor force participation rate is down even lower than it was when I was running. I think it's something like 61.2% right now, which means that only 61.2% of Americans who are of working age are actually working right now. And this was always my great fear, is that more and more people are going to get pushed out of the workforce and become detached. And you are going to see some very, very terrible manifestations of that. So that was Trump, and then that's what we're seeing right now in different ways.
So let me ask you, what's your theory as to why mainstream media has treated you so harshly? Because, Krystal and I were just talking about this earlier. What's that, Andrew? We missed that.
I was just saying, why have they treated me so shabbily?
So, Krystal and I were talking about this earlier. There was just a New York Times article that came out. The headline, what was the headline again?
Headline was like, new poll shows the leading candidate in the New York mayor's race is undecided. And of course, the poll has you up, but they don't mention that until like 6 paragraphs in. And then it's all these caveats about why you being up in the poll doesn't really mean that you're ahead in the race.
And I've seen absurd criticisms that like you're somehow soft on white supremacists or alt-right, or like my favorite one is anti-Asian. Like, so why what's your theory as to why they've treated you so negatively, and why alternative media has actually treated you so favorably?
Wow. I mean, I hadn't really seen it as like, so cut and dried in terms of, certainly alternative media. I'll start there. I think that folks like the two of you and independent voices and podcasters, for the most part, you all rely upon your own judgment and independent point of view, and that's why people like you and follow you. And so if you spend time with a candidate like me or dig into my ideas and you think, oh, well, I might not agree with every aspect of this, but this is interesting, and so let me explore that. And that's been the kind of reception I've gotten from many independent voices and podcasters and what you characterize the alternative media, Kyle. In terms of the mainstream media, I think it's frankly like the inverse dynamic, where like I'm not someone that, for the most part, they have been able to trade access with for years and years. And so my rise in popularity, or the fact that I'm leading in the polls, is something that they find somewhat foreign or threatening, I guess, because it's like from outside of the institutions that they've spent so much time within or trafficking with. And so I just think there's like this native resistance. But it has been disappointing. Like, you hope that journalists would frankly use their heads, use their judgment, look up and say, well, let's say in this case, Andrew Yang's leading the polls. And instead of trying to poo-poo that, dig into like, why is that? And if they dug into why it is, they would find that a lot of people in New York City are very frustrated with politics as usual, and they're not that excited about electing someone who's been embedded in some of these low-functioning institutions for years and years and years.
Yeah. Do you feel like your coverage has been different during the mayoral race than it was during the presidential race? Because just from my, outsider perspective, and I try to keep up with what you're up to, but I can't say I follow every single news item. So my surface level, it's really, I'm sorry, I'm failing you there. But my surface level impression is during the presidential race, the effort was just to ignore you. Leave you off of graphics, just like ignore that you were on the stage, ignore that you're in the polls, just kind of push you off altogether. This time around, it seems to be, I think, because they can't ignore you because you're leading in the polls, there's a more sort of aggressively negative approach. At least, again, that's been my impression. Is that how you've perceived it, or how have you experienced the difference in coverage this time?
I think that your characterization is fairly accurate, Krystal. Certainly when I was running for president, I always saw the enemy as oblivion, or just being ignored completely. And this time, it's something different. It's different ways to try and explain away or minimize the objective success of our campaign thus far. Where if you look at any objective measurement, whether polling or number of individual donors or number of volunteers or excitement on the street, then I'm ahead, and there have been a lot of accounts that have not taken the obvious, to measure, where it's like, well, let's figure out the field and why does it look the way it does? So I think that your characterization is more or less accurate. And I will say that it's fueled in large part because there are, let's call it 8 major candidates in this race. And most of them have little recourse but to try and plant negative stories about me. That's like their go-to move. Because if you're behind in the polls and you're looking up and then you're like, well, what are we going to do? It's like, let's call a friendly journalist and try and stick it to Yang like that. So you have 7 campaigns trying to fuel negative coverage. And many journalists, frankly, will play into that because, it's the path of least resistance.
So this question is going to sound like it's a joke, but I actually mean it seriously. You took a stand against genitally mutilating baby boys, and I want to ask you how you came to the position that cutting off the tips of baby dicks is wrong. Because, and I like what I was raised in an environment where that was viewed as like, that's cultural or that's part of the tradition, and it's very, very widespread. And it's astonishing how few people have actually come to your position, which I think is objectively the correct position. So how did your mind get changed on that?
Well, we had our minds focused on this when our boys were born. And so, your son is born, and then you are faced with that choice, and then you start thinking like, wait, why do people like choose to do what they do? And first, let me say that in my mind, it should be completely up to parents and families what they decide to do with their children. But I did find that at least like the default assumption that you should do a certain thing should be held to light, like, to a higher degree, Kyle. So we just learn through experience, like you're a parent, you have to make a decision for your child, and then you start reflecting on how things are presented and whether there are genuine health benefits in a way that some people take for granted.
Has it been hard? Your presidential campaign, part of what was really exciting about it is because it was about really big and structural and potentially transformational ideas. Have you found it challenging at all to transfer that sort of platform down to the city level? And as part of that answer, what was it that really made you think the next right move is to try to run for mayor of New York?
Krystal, it's so perceptive because running for president, again, the enemy was being ignored, and we were running on this vision for a human-centered economy that works for people, measuring our success differently, putting money into people's hands, improving our way of life. And there was like a purity and joy to the presidential campaign that I still treasure every day, and like all the people that supported us. Running for mayor is a different landscape. The values are the same, where my goal is to reignite New York City's economy, because right now, frankly, we're badly wounded, but also improve our way of life by putting cash relief into people's hands, by getting people high-speed internet, by getting people basic financial services. They don't have to rely upon check cashers and money lenders and even pawn shops. So the values are the same, but you have to calibrate the policies differently to account for a different operating environment. Now, one of the things that a lot of people became familiar with me during the presidential, and so they think, okay, like Andrew Yang, UBI guy, big idea guy, wants to give everyone money, which I do, and if I could do that here in New York, I totally would. But one of the ways that the campaign was able to grow is that I actually have a fairly keen operational mindset where you have to try to generate value and in some cases revenue, depending upon the type of organization you are. You have to work with what you have. You can't get too far in front of yourself in terms of what you're going to frankly tell people you can deliver. Like, it has to be something that you're confident you're going to be able to deliver. So I enjoy aspects of this, Krystal, because a lot of it's so real, it's so gritty. Today I'm going to be doing an event on, frankly, getting the trash picked up, like in New York City. And so that's a very different type of idea than giving everyone money and elevating our way of life. But it's very important to 8.3 million people that their trash gets picked up. So there's like a different character to the issues, but I'm still excited about it just because I like trying to solve problems and make things better for people.
So during the presidential race, you called for decriminalizing all drugs, which puts you in a position, I honestly think, above and beyond all the other politicians who were running. I think that's an even better position than what Bernie Sanders was advocating for. So today we got the news that apparently there's a deal that's been worked out in New York where they might end up legalizing marijuana.
Marijuana's coming to New York State.
That's right. That's right.
I hope they sign the bill as soon as possible, but it would be particularly fun if they signed it on April 20th. Then it would give everyone like a cause to celebrate.
That's right, yes. But my question for you is, as mayor of New York City, would you try to go beyond that and decriminalize all substances and copy the model that we know works, which is Portugal?
I think we should acknowledge that the war on drugs has been a failure, and that far too often it's been a war on people, a war on human beings. And we should also acknowledge that there have been major corporations spending billions of dollars turning people into addicts in different ways, and then criminalizing addiction strikes me as the wrong approach. As a basic example, you've had billions of dollars getting people hooked on opiates, and then some of them end up switching to heroin or another opiate that was not the original substance. But then when you turn to them and say, okay, we're going to bust you for heroin, it's like, well, we spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to frankly get you addicted to a similar substance. So I would be instructing the DAs and NYPD to target folks who are trying to get others addicted, but not folks who have levels of a substance that are intended for personal use or personal consumption. There's a massive difference between having, a lot of a drug intended for trafficking or sale, and then being someone who's using it in the privacy of your home.
Yeah. New York City is going to face a pretty tough landscape, both from a budgetary perspective. There's, getting schools fully reopened. As you said, the economy. It's going to take some time to get everything rebooted there. What do you see as the biggest challenges? This is a really tough job that you're trying to sign yourself up for, trying to get elected to. What do you think the landscape looks like?
Well, I'm a numbers guy, Krystal, and as are you. I mean, I think you're a CPA, so you'd have a similar frame. But we're down 30,000 lives, friends, family members, neighbors. We're down 600,000 jobs, 60 million tourists who supported about half of those missing jobs, 84% of commuters, 70% of subway ridership. Thousands of small businesses have closed or are closing. And when you look around, you can feel this. I mean, this city is struggling, it's wounded. And as great as many of our priorities are, it's going to be really, really hard to solve a lot of our problems if the streets are still filled with empty storefronts, if the office buildings are still empty. So job number one has to be to send a very, very clear message that New York City is open for business, it's open for travel, it's open for concerts and all the things that make New York City great. Nightlife, I think nightlife's a major priority. So these are the things that I'm going to be focused on. First is making New York City the fastest COVID comeback recovery city. And I do think there's a ton of potential energy both here in New York and outside of New York. I'll even use you all as an example. After you do get vaccinated, wouldn't you love to visit New York? Anyone listening to this, don't you miss New York City? It's been a little while, probably.
I personally miss New York City. As someone who used to live there, I miss it a lot.
That's what I'm talking about. So as soon as it's safe for us all to travel and get together, I've already committed to having the country's biggest post-COVID celebration. Saying, look, New York City's open for tourism, and remind people of all the joy and excitement that comes with New York City in good times. Because right now, the images that a lot of people have are, frankly, pandemic related. It might be people leaning out of windows and banging pots and pans. So we have to give them a very different sense of New York to give a lot of our small businesses a real path to recovery.
So I have a very broad question for you, but I'm really curious what your answer is. How would you describe your politics?
Wow, Kyle. I would characterize myself as data-driven and motivated to improve people's lives. So if someone presents something to me and I think it'll work for people, I'll probably be excited about it. I don't know if there's a label for that. I think one of the things that was interesting about the presidential campaign was that when I was coming up, there were different people who responded to me in different ways, in part because I was a little bit hard to categorize or classify politically or ideologically. I don't know if there's a school of thought to what I represent or how I try and inform myself, but I think I'm just driven by a desire to make people's lives better, and I want to rely upon relatively objective measurements to do so.
I think you're right. I think that made you hard to categorize. I think it is part of why you had, my recollection is more actual crossover Trump support than any other candidate, which was weirdly used to like cast aspersions on you. I think it's also created some suspicion of like, who is this guy really? What is he really up to? Are there thinkers or past politicians or philosophers that you sort of look up to as role models or model yourself after?
Well, I'm the first to say that universal basic income was not Andrew Yang's idea at all, and that it was championed most prominently by Martin Luther King. And he was fighting for a guaranteed minimum income. It is what he was actually fighting for when he was assassinated. And his book, Chaos or Community, just lays out the case very, very clearly. So it's strange that his teachings have lain dormant for decades because the economy has borne out, frankly, some of his more dire warnings. And one of the things that he said at the time was that we need to reach out to our poor white brothers and sisters and build common cause with them. And he said that they're going to try and keep us from doing that, but we have to try and do that. And this was unfortunately literally weeks before he was assassinated. So I would like to see my role as reinvigorating energy or interest in his vision. It's one reason why his son, Martin Luther King III, has endorsed me and is co-chairing my mayoral campaign. Martin and I spent a lot of time together when I was in Atlanta and Georgia campaigning for Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff. So to the extent that I'm inspired by a figure, and I don't know if people consider Martin Luther King, a political figure so much as like a historical or spiritual figure, but when I was in Atlanta, I had the privilege of visiting Dr. King's childhood home with his son, who had childhood memories there, and we looked out the front stoop at the view that Dr. King saw every morning when he woke up. And on the left, you could see some very nice houses, and then on the right, you could see some very poor houses. And he said this is one of the things that drove his father. And down the street at the King Center, there's this very clear vision statement about trying to combat the three evils of racism, poverty, and war. And I think that most people think about Martin Luther King Jr. where the first one is concerned, which is racism. But I'm going to suggest that poverty was right up there and should be.
So, Andrew, I want you to talk to me for a little bit about regulation, because I remember when I went through your presidential platform, one of the criticisms I had is that I came across something about sunsetting regulations after a certain number of years. There's like an automatic sunset provision on government regulations. Is that your current view on government regulations? And how involved would you be as mayor with sort of regulating the excesses of Wall Street?
Well, Kyle, I remember that well. And, the point I was trying to make with that was really that we need to examine some of the thickets of rules that have kind of taken on a life of their own that might have been useful at one point, but maybe they're less helpful now. And in the New York City context, I cannot tell you how many people I talk to who are small business owners who say that they get reached out to only to check up on whether they're satisfying certain requirements, and that three agencies will reach out to them, and then one will say this is fine, and the second will say it's not fine, you need to make this change, and then the third will say something different. And they're throwing up their hands. They feel very much at the mercy of various agencies who reach out to them only to see whether they're complying with various rules. And one agency will tell them that it's fine. Another agency will say it's not fine. They need to make a change. The third agency will say something else. And the agencies don't talk to each other. And I talked to one small business owner in Jamaica, Queens, who missed a hearing. And because she missed a hearing, then her fine was doubled. So what started out as a $1,000 fine became a $2,000 fine, and she couldn't afford the original $1,000 fine. And so now she's just like, I don't know what to do. And this, by the way, was a Black woman, small business owner, like exactly the kind of person that, frankly, we should be trying to help at every turn. And so I think that there are real opportunities for us to streamline some of the workings of these agencies, particularly where small businesses are concerned. I've already committed to trying to create a digital one-stop shop for these businesses. And tell people, look, to the extent that our agencies are complex and bureaucratic, we should be suffering that, not you. You know what I mean? It's like, boy, are you the business owner? Are you the parent or citizen? Like, you should not be banging your head into a desk trying to figure out our red tape. And right now, a lot of folks have said to me that that is their situation where the city is concerned and they don't have a choice because the city is this very large, complicated set of bureaucracies. And if you can't figure it out, then it's on you. And that's not really the way we should be operating in the 21st century at this point. One of my core goals is to just make government more user-friendly and accountable and human. One of the things I was joking about, but it's accurate, like I'm going to have a czar of a number of things. Like I've already committed to appointing, for example, a deputy mayor of culture, entertainment, and nightlife, because I think the nightlife industry is actually crucial to New York City's recovery. But I need to have a person, because you need to have a person that you can hold accountable. And the goal is to make that person then have the responsibility to build out an organization and system so that they can actually field incoming problems. But I'd much rather that approach than here's the faceless bureaucracy and it's on you to navigate it. And if you can't navigate it, then tough luck, and then we're going to come stick it to you.
So that's a really interesting point, and this is something that I've had some personal experience with as well. My father was a small business owner. He had owned a number of businesses over the course of his life, and so if I understand your view properly, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the idea that for smaller businesses, for regular folks, they seem to be dealing with too much red tape and there's too much regulation, and it doesn't make a lot of the regulations don't make sense, and there's not enough communication and all that stuff. But is it fair to say that perhaps we have a problem that's on the opposite end of the spectrum for the different sizes of businesses? So in other words, the bigger the corporation, the more money, the more wealthy the individual, the more power they have, the more there's like no regulation, and they can get away with things that are egregious to the extent that on Wall Street, a lot of these companies are too big to fail, and they have fraud as a business model, to steal the phrase from Bernie Sanders. So do you view it in that sort of way, that like the little guy and the small businesses are overregulated, but the big ones are underregulated?
I do, Kyle. I mean, we can see that really clearly. And you have a company like Amazon that's worth $1.5 trillion, paying nothing in federal taxes and just running rings around our government. You have these giant social media companies that are selling our data and profiting to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. And then you see our legislators just grandstanding and engaged in theatrics when they should have been having a much more serious conversation about what these social media companies mean to our society and our democracy years ago. I mean, we're relying upon provisions in a 1996 law that was written before Facebook even existed to regulate Facebook. Like, how does that make any sense at all? So you can look up and down at the fact that the megacorps have been getting away with incredible abuses. And our government has been out to lunch on them. And then you have these little guys who are just trying to do the right thing, and then we're all over them. So I think your description of this, Kyle, is right on, and I'd agree with it.
Yeah. All right. So, Andrew, I love you and am not unbiased where you're concerned. But I also want to level with you. I really hated what you wrote about BDS in an op-ed that was generally about your approach to the Jewish community. You said a Yang administration will push back against the BDS movement, which singles out Israel for unfair economic punishment. Not only is BDS rooted in anti-Semitic thought and history, harkening back to fascist boycotts of Jewish businesses, it's also a direct shot at New York City's economy. Do you see criticism of Israel as fundamentally anti-Semitic?
I do not see criticism of Israel as fundamentally anti-Semitic. I think BDS is a very different thing than criticism of, let's say, the Netanyahu administration or even of some of Israel's policies.
Well, it's an attempt to push back on the occupation of the occupied territories, what's seen as an illegal occupation by international law. It's modeled on the successful movement in South Africa. It's nonviolent. What is it about that movement that you single out to say that is anti-Semitic and equivalent? I mean, you equate it essentially to fascism.
The BDS specifically, as an organization, as a movement, has refused to disavow extremist elements that have frankly declared that Israel does not even have a right to exist. So that's quite extreme. It's very, very different than what you described earlier, Krystal, in terms of people having a political point of view on Israel or an administration or its policies.
So it's not the tactics per se, but some of the people that are involved that they haven't condemned or distanced themselves from? Is that the issue?
Oh, so BDS as an organization, as a movement, has refused to disavow extremist elements that have essentially said Israel does not have a right to exist.
So, Andrew, let me ask you this then, because the more I looked into BDS, the more I saw nuances, and perhaps, it doesn't make the most sense to take the most extremist elements of a group and define the whole movement that way. And, we've learned that lesson in the context of other movements and other groups. But would you concede that there's a difference between, say, boycotts, divestment, and sanctions of all of Israel versus boycott, divestment, and sanctions specifically of the illegally occupied territories? Because again, as Krystal pointed out, that is the model that effectively worked in apartheid South Africa.
No, I'm not sure I understand the distinction you're drawing, Kyle. Genuinely, I'm just not sure I understand it.
Right. I can explain it further if you want. It's the areas that it's a matter of historical record and fact that are being illegally occupied right now, that the international community all agrees. There's no dispute over it. Some elements of the BDS movement only want to boycott, divest, and sanction from those particular areas. So in other words, the other areas of Israel, they leave alone, but particularly the occupied territories, they say, let's do boycotts, divestment, and sanctions in order to try to bring about Palestinian human rights. Don't you think there's a difference between boycotting in the areas specifically where they're violating international law and boycotting areas where they're not?
I'm on the record as supporting a two-state solution, which I think is a fairly mainstream perspective. And if I understand your question, Kyle, people who are advocating for a two-state solution, I would agree with that sentiment.
So here's the other thing about it, Andrew. Why did you want to make this statement? Because I guess what bothered me, I'm just leveling with you on this, you'd taken some criticism in the Orthodox Jewish community because of the position you had and some of the statements you made about circumcision. And then you put out this statement. I mean, I know you make the case BDS is tied to New York City's economy. It's kind of a tenuous connection there. Why was it that you decided to make this statement? Because it felt, I'll just be frank with you, it felt like pandering, which is not something that you normally do, because you'd taken criticism in this other area and you wanted to go over and above to signal your support here. Just talk a little bit about your thinking of why you thought it was important to put this in this particular op-ed.
The economic ties between New York City and Israel are very, very significant and very real. So I wouldn't just put that aside, Krystal, especially if you're in the situation New York's in now. So sorry, you said something else in your, it was around whether this was sort of an a response to something that had gone before. It's genuinely the case that New York City is the home to more Jews than any place outside of Israel. It's like a very, very serious responsibility to the global Jewish community. And it's something that I would take very seriously as mayor. And so, no, it's something that I think you do have to think about the context of New York City for the global community in that light. And that was frankly a bit of a learning for me, where I frankly did not realize just the level of importance of the mayoralty of New York City to the global community.
So final follow-up on this, then I promise we'll let it go. But my question is, if Palestinians resist violently, that's called terrorism. Everybody says it's terrorism. They denounce it. If they can't resist peacefully through boycotts and sanctions and an economic approach, what approach would you say is okay? How can they resist to try to bring about human rights and end the occupation and have a state? How can they resist that's acceptable if they can't do it peacefully and they can't do it violently?
I think that that's an oversimplification, Kyle. I think that there are many peaceful ways to advocate for a two-state solution that don't involve some of the measures that BDS has recommended.
All right, fair enough. All right, we'll move on from this, Andrew, and we appreciate you answering all of these questions because I know it's something that's important to you and to us and to our audience as well. Talk to me about the school opening situation in New York City right now. What is the current status, and what are your thoughts about where things need to go?
I'm a public school parent. My children's schools have been closed for the better part of over a year, and the parents and families that are suffering the most through that are the families that can least afford it, where data clearly shows that online education is 30 to 70% less effective than in-person instruction. And so any parent out there, Krystal, you may resemble this, but any parent who has this sinking feeling that our kids are not exactly thriving during this time, it's like we feel that way for a reason. I mean, like our kids are not thriving during this time. And worse yet, 29% of New York City residents don't have high-speed internet at home. So those are disproportionately Black and brown families. So for them, it's not even 30 to 70% worse, and maybe 100% worse. And in my mind, we should have been trying to open schools for those kids and at-risk kids and younger kids who frankly had lower risk of both contracting or spreading the coronavirus as soon as possible, before now. So that's something that I've said in a number of different environments, and I dearly hope that this is not an issue by the time I take office, but I think schools should be open as quickly as possible to the extent that it's safe to do so, and I think that we can be fighting harder for that.
So I have one more difficult question for you, and you knew this one was coming because Kyle Klinsky and Medicare for All are like this, okay? But so here it is. During your presidential campaign, you said you support universal health care, and you said you support Medicare for All. But then when you were pressed on it a little bit by journalists, you said, well, I support Medicare for All if we're talking about the slogan, not necessarily the bill. You just mean Medicare for All as a stand-in for universal health care. My question is, I know you're a data-driven guy because I've seen a lot of evidence of that. I think your solutions are very well thought out. You're very policy-oriented, and I respect that very much. And so when you look at the Commonwealth Fund studies, for example, and you look at the World Health Organization studies, for example, it's not a coincidence that, as a general rule, 7 out of the top 10 or 8 out of the top 10 healthcare systems in the world are all single-payer healthcare systems. So since the data shows the single-payer healthcare systems are the best, why not sign on for a full single-payer system? And as a follow-up to that, what's your healthcare plan for New York?
Kyle, I was laughing because I don't think this was a difficult question. I mean, if you look at my book, I literally say like a single-payer healthcare system would be the best approach. And so I'm on board, and I'm going to try my best to provide something to that effect here in New York City. There is an NYC Cares healthcare program that does not cover everyone by a long shot. It covers just a few people, and the public hospitals here that serve the uninsured and indigent are very much overwhelmed right now by demand. So I want to do everything I can to try to universalize healthcare here in New York City. I'm for universal healthcare in the United States. I think that people like Bernie who've been fighting for this have been fighting for the right thing. You've been fighting for the right thing. I'm on board. I just thought, being for Medicare for All, there's a specific bill. There are different versions of universal health care. The pandemic has demonstrated that we've been doing healthcare all wrong, and I would be right there with anyone else who's trying to change that.
That's awesome to hear. What do you think of how de Blasio has been as mayor?
I will tell you all, just my interactions with Bill and the rest of it. So I got to know Bill. We were friendly on the presidential trail. I think he's a good man. He's like a good human being. But as I've been running for mayor and going around New York City, I run into more and more people that have felt let down by some aspect of his administration and his leadership over this last number of months. So that I guess sums up like how I feel about Bill, is that I think he's a good man, but I think that the city could use a different mayor right about now.
I wanted to also ask you about Governor Cuomo, who has been beset by scandal. I mean, first there was nursing home, bad decision-making, potentially corrupt decision-making, a cover-up of the true number of deaths and lying about that. Then there's a rash of allegations ranging from, inappropriate comments to inappropriate touches to things that would rise the level of sexual assault. And then the latest shoe to drop is it's being reported that he gave special VIP access to coronavirus tests to his friends and family members, including his brother, who happens to have a primetime show on CNN, having a state doctor go to his house, give him a swab, the patrollers taking this to a lab, jumping in front of the line at a time when regular people could not get coronavirus tests. So this is very important service that he was providing to his friends and his family. Do you think that he should resign?
I've said that he should step aside and let this investigation proceed. The same way you might, frankly, have like a school teacher or a police officer kind of step aside from their role while you're investigating them for potential abuses. And in this case, in my mind, I think most people would agree with this, it would be nearly impossible for him to be able to serve the interests of New Yorkers if he's bogged down continuously with controversy and distraction and folks investigating various problems with his administration. So if he were to step aside, then you'd have Lieutenant Governor Hochul focused on the business of the state, and then the investigation could proceed. I think that would be the best approach.
Finally, Andrew, just give us a preview. What do you have planned next in the campaign, and what do you think you need to do in order to win?
Well, we are in great shape, Krystal. We just need to keep putting out a positive case for New Yorkers, let people know that there really is a brighter future around the corner, that there's so much pent-up energy, both human and otherwise, that's going to, I believe, help launch our own version of the Roaring '20s here in New York City after we get vaccinated, after people have confidence to get together. Certainly, if anyone wants to support my campaign, I would be thrilled. You can go to andrewyang.com and check out our policies. If you do live in New York City, the city will match any donation you make 8-1. I know it's wild, but if you donate $20, the city will give us $160. And so New Yorkers, your donations are worth approximately 800% more than other people's.
As it should be. Andrew, thank you. We really appreciate you and your time as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, man.
Congrats on the new show, guys. You have like awesome chemistry. It's one of these things where individually you were great, but together it's even better. So I'll come back anytime, and hopefully we'll have some good news pretty soon.
Yeah,
that sounds awesome.
Thank you, Andrew. You're a uniquely honest voice, and it's really refreshing. And thanks for taking some of our difficult questions too.
Not at all, Kyle. Really, you guys are the best. Talk to you soon.
So there we have it, Andrew Yang. Really, really interesting guy. There were two more questions that I wanted to ask him that I didn't get to. One of them is he was a rare voice, actually the only voice, that came out in the Democratic primary for decriminalizing sex work during the presidential race.
That's brave too.
I think that's super brave, because there's not, like, that's something you say, and you're not really going to please anybody. Even people who are in favor of it are sort of like quietly in favor of it. You know, like, it doesn't strike me as there's this giant movement. Maybe among sex workers there's some, but like it's not an issue that's met its time yet, you know? And so that was an issue where he sort of led on that. And I was actually going to ask him, in regards to being New York City mayor, will you do anything on that front? Will you decriminalize sex work? Is that something you would consider? And the other thing I wanted to ask him about was the Spain 4-day work week thing, because it reminds me of UBI in the sense that with universal basic income, it's this kind of really simple idea, but it was also new and innovative while somehow classic at the same time, and he kind of injected it into the conversation. So I was curious his thoughts on 4-day work week, because it strikes me as like a similar idea. But Yang overall, I mean, he's a really, really interesting guy. I think he does care deeply about, his specific policies. And it is kind of refreshing to see that he's maintained this giant lead in the New York City mayor race.
Totally. With all the knives out for him.
Yes.
Like, I mean, like I said, last time they just ignored him,
Mhm.
and this time they are going all the way in. I guess that's the thing. They laugh at you, they ignore you, they fight you, and then you win, right?
right,
I mean,
yeah.
that's like literally the trajectory that he's on right now. And I actually thought it was really interesting to hear his reflections on the media, because I was like, are you seeing it the same way that I'm seeing it? And basically his perception is exactly the same, that they have come aggressively after him in the mayoral race. And his reasoning that it's essentially because, look, if they have the power that they want to have, he shouldn't exist. So the fact that even though they tried to stonewall him, he was able to get a lot of attention and excitement and donations and this interesting coalition and assert his ideas, make them part of a national conversation in his presidential run, and now is actively leading in the New York City mayor's race, something that should be total machine politics. His opponents, most of them, I mean, they've been in New York City politics for years and years. They've got direct relationships with the New York media that is covering this race. The fact that Andrew Yang is able to jump right over them and lead in the polls, not that you would take anything for granted, is really an indictment of their own power. Like, this should not be possible, and that, I think, really drives them crazy.
That's absolutely correct. I think so. We asked him that question, and I wanted to actually weigh in with my thoughts on that. I think the reason that they don't like him, they meaning the establishment media and the political establishment, the reason they don't like him is twofold. One, because he's an outsider and he didn't go through the proper channels to climb the ladder in the party, like, you know, like a kiss ass like Mayor Pete. And beyond that, he was the guy, he was the UBI guy. And UBI sounds even more extreme and radical than like Medicare for All. And they don't like that. They don't like ideas that are big, bold, transformational, you know, FDR-esque, if you will, because that really shakes up the system. And so I think those are the reasons that they really dislike him and the knives are out for him. And the other thing is, you made a great point about the media during the presidential race versus now with him. You're right. They pretty much ignored him during the presidential race. They really, at him, Marianne Williamson, there were a few that they were just like, we're going to pretend like you don't even exist.
Right.
Forget it. You're done. You're done. We're not going to cover you at all. And now they can't ignore because he's leading in the polls. And so they go full negative. But here's their problem. It's a paradox for them because they hate him. They want to take him down. But the more they give him negative coverage, the better he does in the polls. And I think the reason is their attacks are so hacky that everybody sees through them. You know what I mean? Like, they're always so shameless and, like, really accusing him of being anti-Asian. Like, stop. Like, if you're going to attack him, don't overreach. And obviously, people could tell, you and I think there are some legitimate criticisms of Andrew Yang.
Yeah.
But none of the criticisms are sensible. They all make Andrew seem way more likable.
Right, exactly. No, it's completely fair game, in my opinion, to explore, like, here's his policy positions, here's what he said on a variety of issues. What does that mean? How does that jive with what he said in the past? What are the implications? Is this the right thing or not? How are voters responding to it? But no, that's not what they're doing at all. To pause on the anti-Asian piece, there was this piece in the New York Times that created this whole question around whether Andrew Yang would be good for Asian Americans. And some of the polling has him leading Asian Americans in the city of New York. He gets like 60% of their vote. So clearly a large minority or potentially majority of Asian Americans in the city think that Andrew Yang is going to be good for them. But they use all this tendentious reasoning. They say, you know, he wasn't the first candidate to condemn the Atlanta shootings. Like, this is some sort of a race. The faster you get to Twitter, the more you care, I guess. I mean, just really, really silly stuff. But it also struck me because it's so the polar opposite of the way they normally use identity. Normally, you'd say, well, this is an Asian American candidate, ergo he must be good for Asian Americans. Which is also, I mean, that was the
gross,
assumption, like with Kamala, right? Like, Kamala is an a woman of color, therefore she's going to be good for women of color. And we're not even going to ask the question whether it might be different based on her policy stances. But with Andrew, weirdly, the fact that he is of Asian descent, they use that to sort of weaponize against him in the total polar opposite of how they normally use identity. So I thought that article in particular is really weird. And then there was also one from Politico where they went through, he got his start on these right-wing podcasts. Ergo, he must be like a secret white nationalist. Name-checking Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, Joe Rogan. to other podcasts. And again, maybe if you all had covered him and like acknowledged that he existed, maybe he wouldn't have had to lean so heavily on independent media. But these guys have large platforms. Some of them I like, some of them I really don't like, some of them I respect, some of them I really don't respect. But they have large platforms, large audiences, and God forbid you go and talk to an audience that doesn't already ideologically align with you. I mean, it's just like, it's so ridiculous that that would be an attack. What the attack is, you're trying to appeal to people who don't already agree with you? That's a bad thing?
Yeah, that always blew my mind, especially because if you're an effective communicator, then what you do is you get people who, on paper, upfront, nominally disagree. You get them to sign on to your agenda and your ideas, which is only exactly the thing that everybody is supposed to want. Like, don't you want people to be deconverted from ideas that we find odious and primitive and wrong? But they really do turn that into, like, no, that's a negative because these people at some point were not pure and good. And so to now get somebody who wasn't pure and good to your side means you're just sort of sullying your side with impurity or whatever.
Right.
It's a very childish way of thinking.
But very common.
Oh, it's incredibly common, but I do think it's also sort of disingenuous. Like, I don't know to what extent people who make those arguments actually believe those arguments, because if you really stop and think about it for a second, you realize it's the silliest thing you've ever heard. One of the, my biggest honor in doing what I've done online is that I get a number of people who come up to me at Politicon and whenever I do some public events where they say, hey man, you stopped me from going down that alt-right pipeline, you deconverted me from Steven Crowder or Ben Shapiro or whoever it may be. And those are my proudest moments, And this is something that they actively are against. And to your point, you brought up the thing about the article, right-wing podcasts, to lump Joe Rogan with Ben Shapiro. I mean, that's damn near criminal. And you don't have to agree with Joe Rogan on everything. Of course I don't agree with Joe Rogan on everything, but it's beyond absurd.
You voted for Bernie Sanders.
Voted for Bernie Sanders. I mean,
so silly.
And Ben Shapiro, all he does is standard conservative talking points all day long. To lump those two together is absurd. But again, it's not like Andrew Yang went on to Ben Shapiro's podcast to be like, I agree with you on everything. He went on there to be like, let me make my case for UBI. Let me make my case for whatever left-wing idea you fill in the blank, right?
Yeah, and by the way, he was good at that, and it
very
worked.
Good at it.
And
right.
Trump supporters converted to Andrew Yang supporters.
Right, and that's the thing, is they try to make that out to be a negative, when in reality, if you think about it, going into an election, you want somebody who can hold their own base and hold their own supporters and also have crossover appeal. You want as many people as possible to like you and agree with you. And what they do is they turn that into something that's dirty and wrong. And it gets back to, it's because he didn't come up through the proper channels. Mm-hmm. He did it as an outsider. And if you do it as an outsider, they look at you scornfully. You know, a lot of it has to do with, and I hate to do the talk about Substack because whenever I read the word Substack, I cringe now because it's enough. But yeah, there's a lot of people who are knives out for Substack, and it's because, oh my God, you're spreading negative ideas and bad ideas. Every ideology you can imagine is on Substack. Mm-hmm. And it's people who are trying to make it outside of the conventional system, where in the conventional system, you got to get a foot in the door, and then there's bosses, and there's editors. And I hate to break it to you. People are assholes. They don't know what they're doing. They're not like holier than thou and they have all the answers. So when some independent person writes something of their own volition, their own thoughts, and they put it out there and somebody wants to subscribe to it and somebody wants to support them, that's awesome.
Right.
But they've actually turned that into something that's dirty.
Right, because they don't control the space. And
they're also not entertaining and interesting on their own.
Right. So they have to quash they can't compete, because their shit is so boring and tired and predictable.
And they're propped up by the establishment institutions.
Right. So they can't really compete. So instead, they have to sully and tarnish the whole thing. When, actually the number one politics Substack is this historian who seems to have a very sort of resistance-y ideology, which is why I actually thought Substack might be a little bit saved from that whole thing, but it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
They just pick out the ones or the pieces
or
whatever. We don't like this. Ergo, the whole thing's a disaster. The whole thing's problematic. You should have nothing to do with it whatsoever. But as in the case with Andrew Yang, what they're really doing is just drawing more attention to Substack. And what they're really doing with Yang at this point, especially with media trust at an all-time low, they're just further making the case for Andrew Yang. I mean, I really do. And look, obviously, we had some tough questions for him. The BDS thing is something I've been wanting to ask him about for a while. But arguably, Andrew Yang is one of the most significant figures in modern American political life because of how he put UBI on the table. And I've been making the case, and I know you've been talking about it a lot too, those direct payments have become one of the most potent political policies in American life in the past year. I mean, the transformation on how Americans feel about it, how they think about it, the acceptance of it, bipartisan acceptance of it, this really I think it really transforms people's relationship to the government when it's so incredibly tangible. This money, they passed the bill and the freaking money showed up in my account 2 days later. Like it was there. Or I got the check in the mail. It came, I put it in my account. Like I paid for groceries and I was able to make my rent. And then you go, it's a light bulb moment. It's like, oh my God, the government could be doing this for me all the time.
Yep, that's
they
right.
just normally choose not to. They just normally choose to let me like hang out to dry. But they don't have to make that choice. They could actually make another choice. And Andrew Yang really is the political figure who sparked that conversation. I've asked him before, and I wish I could remember the numbers off the top of my head. But unlike him, he said I was a CPA, which is technically true, but I'm actually not good at remembering numbers. I wish I could remember the numbers of how unpopular UBI was when he started talking about it.
It was not popular. I was against it.
Not only was it not popular, but people didn't even know what it was.
Right, yeah.
So, and then once you explained to people what it was, they were like, no. So the way that he's moved put that conversation on the table in a way that was very courageous when it was wildly unpopular. And the way that has moved in part because of him, but also obviously large part because of the pandemic and the exigencies there, that has truly been transformative.
It absolutely has. And this conversation reminds me of the Stockton study that we just discussed recently. And all they did there, that was $500 is what they gave people, which seems like not a lot, right?
Right.
But it changed people's lives.
Yes.
And when you looked at the numbers, there were virtually no downsides. All the money went to the things that you would expect a responsible adult to spend it on.
Right.
It went to food, was the main thing, and then after that it was like utilities, and you told the wonderful story of the guy who couldn't get a day off of work to try to get a better job, and he hated his job, and then with that $500 he was able to take one day off of work and then get a better job. It changed his life for the better. The people who were part of that UBI program were more likely to become employed.
That's right.
So the argument of like, it breeds laziness, that's just not true. So you're right.
Polar
He sort
opposite.
of put this on the map. Now you're getting little tastes of it with the COVID relief bills, even though it's not recurring. People get that one-time check. But like, you're right that people are having the light bulb moment of like, oh, so you can have a solution that's as simple and as straightforward as like, I want to cut you a check. And people are loving it. And there was one more point that I wanted to make. Oh, yes. So Andrew, let's say for argument's sake, Andrew wins the race for mayor. He has a successful term.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about his prospects running for president again in a situation like that?
I mean, they're still going to hate him.
I know they're still going to hate him,
but the people will like him.
The people. So
Yeah.
the question is, do you see a situation, almost like a Bernie situation, where even though there's this giant institutional bias against him, that he runs again and he does well? Do you think it's possible for somebody like that to win? Because listen, fact of the matter is, right now, let's be honest, as gross as it is to say, the heir apparent is Kamala. Kamala's the VP. Joe Biden's half dead in office. Right?
He says he wants to serve 2 terms.
Okay,
we'll see.
right. Make it to like Thursday, buddy. All right? Make it to next Thursday and we'll have a conversation. So Kamala's the heir apparent because now her national profile has gone up tremendously as vice president.
Yeah, that's why she was picked for.
But let's not forget she couldn't even make it a fucking Iowa when she ran. Everybody was like, not buying it, don't like you.
There was an overwhelming mass of public grassroots support for Kamala Harris, Kyle. You're just forgetting it.
Right. So, but
in every CNN green room across the country.
those are the only ones who supported her. But like, don't you think in a situation like that you actually do have a potential future presidential run for somebody like Andrew Yang, or is that mountain too tall to climb?
I don't think the mountain is too tall to climb. I think it's contingent on a lot of things, how these next few years go and how the public feels about Kamala and how she acquits herself in the role as vice president. It also, though, depends a lot on like how much does Andrew want to rock the boat. Because it's one thing when you're basically nobody, you got nothing to lose. You don't know these freaking people. You don't care if they hate you or not, or love you or indifferent to you or whatever, to jump in, put out your ideas and see what happens. That's very different from now I'm an established political figure with a track record of success, and I'm contemplating taking on the big machine and the Democratic establishment and doing it like blatantly and in their face. I have no idea if that's something that he would have an appetite to do. But in some ways, that's actually the biggest question.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
So before we wrap it up, I just want to say I love your dress today. I love how colorful it is.
Thank you, sir. I like your shirt today.
Well, thank you.
Very nice.
You look like well, I can't say that though. I was gonna say you look like a Fruit Loop, but it sounded like I don't know. Doesn't that sound sort of derogatory, even though it's not?
It sounds very derogatory.
Like I meant it as a compliment, but it sounds derogatory.
To me, it reads very Easter egg. Like I just went all the way in on spring. I just jumped over the transitional phase and I just went all the way in on spring.
I'm big on colors. I think it looks wonderful.
Well, thank you, Kyle.
I wanted to compliment your dress, and then also just do a shameless plug real quick. If you're listening to the audio version of this, get your act together. I don't know what you're doing. Pay the $5 a month on Substack. Get the video version so you can see how Krystal Ball looks like a pack of Skittles / Fruit Loop / awesome, colorful, bright, beautiful dress. So yeah, $5 on Substack. You get these shows a day early on Friday, but don't worry if you don't pay the $5. We still love you. You can keep listening to the audio version on whatever audio, podcasts you listen on, or you can, sign up on Substack for free and then get the audio as soon as it drops as well on Saturday.
Well, and obviously because everybody, like all the cool kids, hate Substack now. You've got to be on Substack.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the other pitch for it. It's just
like, say fuck you to those assholes.
Just subscribe to say fuck you to those people. That's a great reason to sub right there.
That genuinely is a good reason to do it. That genuinely is a good reason to do it. But anyway, that's what we got for everybody this week.
Thanks, guys. See you next week.